A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we will end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to. You will be making your own fertilizer very soon. That was Donald Trump at a White House roundtable just days ago, announcing his plan to solve American agriculture's fertilizer crisis. Tariff Canadian potash, force domestic production, make America self-sufficient. Within hours, American farmers were panicking. Agriculture industry groups were issuing urgent warnings, and Canadian potash producers were quietly calling alternative buyers in Europe and Asia to discuss redirecting supply. This is the story of how Trump's latest tariff threat exposed the most dangerous vulnerability in American agriculture, how a commodity Americans cannot produce became a weapon pointed at their own farmers, and how the very people Trump claimed to be helping are about to pay a devastating price for economic delusion. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you why potash was always the wrong target, how American farmers depend on a supply they cannot replace, and what happens when you threaten to cut off the one thing that makes modern agriculture possible. Let's start with a fundamental truth that Trump either doesn't know or doesn't care about. American agriculture is completely dependent on Canadian potash. Not partially dependent, structurally, fundamentally, existentially dependent. Potash is one of 3 critical nutrients every plant needs to survive. You need nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium, which comes from potash. Without all 3, crops fail, yields collapse, food production stops. The United States uses approximately 5.3 million tons of potash annually. American farmers spread it on corn fields in Iowa, wheat fields in Kansas, potato farms in Idaho. It is essential for moisture retention, disease prevention, and maximizing crop yields. There is no substitute. You either have potash or your crops die. Here is the problem. The United States produces only about 400,000 tons of potash domestically. That covers roughly 7% of annual demand. The other 93% must be imported, and where does that imported potash come from? 79% comes from Canada, specifically from Saskatchewan, which sits atop the largest high-quality potash deposits in the world and produces about 1/3 of global supply. Canada has 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves. The United States has 220 million tons. Canada produced 21.9 million tons in 2023. America produced 400,000 tons. The numbers aren't close. They're not even in the same universe. American agriculture depends on Canadian potash the way humans depend on oxygen, and Trump just threatened to cut off the supply. This isn't the first time Trump has threatened potash. Earlier this year, he initially included fertilizer in blanket 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The response was immediate and desperate. Between early January and late February, potash prices jumped from $233 per short ton to $348. Republican lawmakers from farming states flooded the White House with calls. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins personally intervened. Senator Chuck Grassley publicly pressured Trump to exempt fertilizer from tariffs. Trump eventually backed down, reducing the tariff from 25% to 10%. Even that 10% tariff increased costs for struggling farmers. No, just months later, Trump is threatening very severe tariffs. His exact words, which in Trump speak could mean anything from 50 to 200%. This time, he is threatening because he thinks tariffs will somehow force America to produce its own potash and become self-sufficient. It is economic delusion on a scale that would be comical if it weren't about to devastate American agriculture. Here is why that will never happen. First, potash mining depends on naturally occurring deposits. You cannot create potash, you cannot manufacture it in a lab, you can only extract it from underground deposits that took millions of years to form. The United States simply doesn't have sufficient high-quality deposits to meet domestic demand. Saskatchewan has massive, easily accessible potash deposits that make extraction cheap and efficient. American deposits are smaller, lower quality, and more expensive to access. That is not a policy failure, that is geology. Second, building new potash mines takes 10 to 15 years. You need to identify suitable deposits, secure environmental permits, construct massive underground mining operations, build processing facilities, and develop transportation infrastructure. Even if American companies decided tomorrow to invest billions in new potash mines, those mines wouldn't be operational until the late 2030s. What are American farmers supposed to do in the meantime? Not plant crops. Third, the economics don't work. Canadian potash is cheaper to produce because of better geology and established infrastructure. Even with tariffs, American producers couldn't compete on price. Veronica Nye, chief economist at the Fertilizer Institute, put it bluntly: any rise in United States fertilizer output propelled by tariffs would mean producers are being protected from cheaper foreign imports. All of that would raise costs. Translation: Trump's tariff strategy will make American farmers less competitive, not more. When Trump threatens Canadian potash, the assumption is that American farmers have alternatives. They don't. There are only 3 major potash exporters in the world: Canada, Russia, and Belarus. Those 3 countries control the vast majority of global production. So if Trump tariffs Canadian potash, where are farmers supposed to get their supply? Russia, the country America is sanctioning over Ukraine. Belarus, the dictatorship that helped facilitate Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made this point explicitly: they would have to buy it somewhere else. Namely, Russia would be the option. I think most Americans would agree that we would much rather get our potash from our friends in Canada than from Russia and Belarus. But Trump doesn't care about geopolitics when he is focused on tariffs, so American farmers face a nightmare scenario: either pay dramatically higher prices for Canadian potash, or start buying from authoritarian regimes that use energy exports as geopolitical weapons. Russia and Belarus produce about 37% of the world's potash. If American demand suddenly shifts to Russian suppliers, global prices spike because Russia and Belarus would have newfound leverage over a desperate buyer. Congratulations, Trump, you just handed Putin control over American food production. While Trump threatens tariffs, Canadian potash producers aren't waiting around. They're actively preparing for American markets to become unprofitable. Saskatchewan produces about 1/3 of the world's potash supply. About half goes to the United States. But Canadian producers have been building relationships with alternative buyers since Trump started his tariff threats. Europe is hungry for potash. Asian markets are growing. Latin American agriculture is expanding. All would happily buy from Canadian suppliers if American demand drops. Nutrien, one of Canada's largest potash producers, recently announced plans to build a new $1 billion export facility in Washington state. That facility will allow Canadian potash to reach Asian markets more efficiently, reducing dependence on American buyers. The Saskatchewan Mining Association has been clear: if American tariffs make the United States market unprofitable, Canadian producers will redirect supply to other global markets. They have the capacity. They have the relationships. Premier Scott Moe said it explicitly: I have faith that Saskatchewan potash producers and exporters would be able to find other global markets to backfill lost United States purchases. So here is what will happen if Trump follows through on severe potash tariffs. Canadian producers will sell less to America and more to everyone else. American farmers will face shortages and dramatically higher prices. The global potash market will restructure around non-American demand. The only losers are American farmers, the ones Trump claims to be helping. At the same White House event where Trump threatened potash tariffs, he announced a $12 billion aid package for farmers. This isn't the first time Trump has paid farmers to absorb the costs of his trade policies. During his first term, Trump gave about $23 billion in aid to farmers hurt by his tariff wars. Farmers are set to receive a near-record $40 billion in government payments this year. Net farm income could fall by more than $30 billion in 2026 due to declining government payments and low crop prices, according to estimates from the University of Missouri. Do you see the trap Trump has created? His tariffs raise costs for farmers. He gives them subsidies to absorb those costs, but the subsidies aren't permanent. They're temporary band aids that don't address the underlying problem. American farmers cannot compete globally when their input costs are artificially inflated by tariffs. Fertilizer accounts for more than 35% of operating costs for corn and wheat producers. That is the single largest input expense. When Trump tariffs potash, he is hitting farmers in their most vulnerable spot. Michael Langmayer, director of the Center for Commercial Agriculture at Purdue University, warned, "The subsidies mark not an end of agricultural subsidies, but a new beginning." Translation: American farmers are about to become permanently dependent on government handouts to survive because their own president made their industry uncompetitive through self-inflicted tariff wounds. To understand how bad things already are, look at soybeans. China stopped purchasing American soybeans for most of 2025. Despite sales resuming in fall, total soybean sales through early November were 40% lower than the previous year. That is not a market correction. That is a market collapse. The American Soybean Association reported farmers expect their third consecutive year of substantial losses, the longest stretch of losses in 2 decades. Now Trump wants to add fertilizer costs on top of lost export markets. He wants to hit farmers with higher input expenses while their revenue is collapsing. The potash debacle exposes something fundamental about Trump's approach to trade. He doesn't understand supply chains. He doesn't understand commodity markets. He doesn't understand the difference between negotiating leverage and mutual dependence. Trump looks at trade like real estate deals. You have something I want. I have something you want. I apply pressure. You fold, I win, but commodities don't work that way. When you depend on a supplier for 92% of a critical input that you cannot produce domestically, you don't have leverage. The supplier does. Especially when that supplier has alternative customers lined up. Canada doesn't need to sell potash to America. They would prefer to, because logistics are easier and the relationship has been stable, but they don't need to. Europe will buy it. Asia will buy it. Latin America will buy it. America absolutely needs Canadian potash. There is no domestic alternative. There are no friendly alternative suppliers. There is no timeline under which America becomes self-sufficient in potash production. When Trump threatens severe tariffs on potash, he is not demonstrating strength. He is demonstrating that he doesn't understand the market he is trying to manipulate. If Trump follows through, Canadian potash prices in America will spike. Farmers preparing to plant spring crops will face impossible choices: pay dramatically higher prices for fertilizer, reduce fertilizer use and accept lower yields, or switch to Russian suppliers and face political backlash. Some farmers will absorb higher costs and pass them to consumers as higher food prices. Some will reduce production, leading to food shortages. Some will go out of business entirely. Canadian potash producers will redirect supply to international markets. The relationships they build with European, Asian, and Latin American buyers won't dissolve if Trump eventually removes tariffs. Those markets will remain open and Canadian producers will have less reason to prioritize American demand. Meanwhile, Russian and Belarusian potash producers will gain market share in America. Putin will gain leverage over American food production. The United States will have traded dependence on a democratic ally for dependence on an authoritarian adversary. All because Trump thinks tariffs are the solution to every problem. American farmers are learning a brutal lesson. When your president treats trade as a zero-sum game and allies as adversaries, you pay the price. They voted for Trump believing he would protect their interests. Instead, he launched trade wars that closed their export markets, imposed tariffs that raise their input costs, and now threatens to cut off access to the single most critical agricultural input they cannot produce domestically. The subsidies Trump offers don't fix the problem. They temporarily mask the pain while the underlying damage accumulates. What farmers need is stable, affordable access to inputs and reliable access to export markets. Trump has destroyed both. Trump threatened very severe tariffs on Canadian potash, thinking it would force America to become self-sufficient in fertilizer production. Instead, he is about to cut off American farmers from a supply they cannot replace, drive up food prices for American consumers, and hand Putin leverage over United States agriculture. The farmers Trump claimed to be helping are about to learn that in his trade war, they were never the priority. They were always just collateral damage. Within hours of Trump's threat, American farmers were panicking because they understand what their president doesn't. You can't tariff your way out of geological reality. And when you try, the only people who get hurt are the ones you promised to protect.